Good afternoon. I'm pretty excited. Both times this morning when I went to actually turn my phone, the stopwatch on, both times I went to activate my phone, it recognized my fingerprints. You've noticed me up here fiddling and faddling with it almost every morning, and this morning, both times, well, this morning the first time, and now this afternoon the second time, it worked right away, so that's got to mean something, right? I guess. Footprints of faith. Sunday evenings, we've been engaged in looking at characters in the Bible, considering what we know about them, what the Bible tells us about their lives, and trying to see what we can learn. Again, it's a gift from God that we have all this revealed to us, that we can see how faith works in His people. We can see how it strengthens them. We can see how they overcome the troubles and toils they face in their life. We can see their stumbles, and we can learn from all of it. We've talked about King Saul, the first king of Israel, the United Kingdom. We talked about David, the second king. We talked about Jonathan, King Saul's son. And this afternoon, I want to talk about Mephibosheth. That name that just rolls off the tongue, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul. I want to consider what we know about him and what the Bible has told us, what that can do for us to help us in our walk with God today. You're going to be surprised maybe on how much we have in common with Mephibosheth. Well, who was he? In 2 Samuel chapter 4 and verse 4, we read, Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, we have the recounting of 1 Samuel 31 of the death of Saul and his son Jonathan in battle against the Philistines. This is what's being described. When they lost that battle and the Philistines were pouring into the area, they were making haste to get out of the way of the coming armies. And apparently, in her haste, the nurse dropped him, and he fell, and he became lame. So we know two main things. The two main things that people know about Mephibosheth is one, wow, what a name. And two, he was lame. Okay? So in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we have the death of his father Jonathan and his grandfather Saul. Then in chapters 2 and 3 of 2 Samuel, we have the civil war in Israel between those followers of David who wanted him to be the king because he had been anointed by Samuel to be the king, and those followers who wanted Saul's son Ishbosheth, another great name, to be the king. And Abner was the mighty man of war, the general of Saul's, that was kind of backing Ishbosheth. And if we're honest, it really looks like Abner was the power behind the throne, and he was kind of using Ishbosheth. But that's my opinion from reading the history. In chapter 3, Abner switches sides. He's no longer going to serve the descendant, the son of Saul. He's going to serve David, and he is murdered by Joab. Hopefully, we'll get to talk about Joab. He's quite a character, isn't he? And then in chapter 4, after we have this introduction to Mephibosheth, Ishbosheth is killed by some of his own followers. They kill him, they take his head, and they take it to David. And they say, here, thinking they're going to win praise from him. They must not know David. Because what happened in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel? Do you remember? You had that foreigner who saw Saul die, said he helped King Saul to die, brought the news to David, and he said, I've got news. King Saul is dead. Remember, Saul's been chasing you. He's been a problem for you. Well, now he's dead, and I helped kill him. And do you remember what David said? Kill this man. How could you dare raise your hand against God's anointed? Well, fast forward to the son Ishbosheth, and his followers murder him, bring his head to David, and they say, here. And what does David say? Second verse, same as the first. Kill these guys. How could you kill such a noble man, the descendant of Saul? And they do. Then chapters 7, David's kingdom is established physically. Both Judah and the tribes of Israel come together and they recognize David as the king of all Israel. And in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel, we have God coming and establishing that everlasting covenant that we talked about this morning with David. That through David, this kingdom would be eternal, talking about the kingdom we enjoy to be a part of now. And then in chapter 9, David has peace all around. God has been good to this man after his own heart. And David says in the beginning of chapter 9 of 2 Samuel, are there any descendants of Jonathan that still live? And he finds out there is one, this Mephibosheth. And David wants to do good to one of the descendants of Jonathan. Because remember when we talked about Jonathan and David, that great love that they had for one another, that great faithfulness one to another. So we read here in verses 6 through 8, he calls Mephibosheth to be brought to him. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, had come to David, he fell on his face and prostrated himself. Okay, put yourself in Mephibosheth's shoes. That was not easy to say when I was thinking of the word shoes. What's just happened? Well, my grandfather was trying constantly to kill David. And then when my grandfather and father were killed, my uncle was set up as the king, and there was a civil war with David. And now he's dead. Pretty much everybody's dead. And now that David has called to me and wants me to come to him. Right? Well, what would you think from a worldly sense? This is probably not going to work out well. So he prostrated himself. Then David said, Mephibosheth? Because even he wanted to say how silly that name was to say out loud. Mephibosheth? I'm sorry. Mephibosheth has a meaning. It's not just a strange sound. Mephibosheth means executioner of idolatry. Or, some translators say, executioner of shame. Because the Hebrew word for idolatry and shame are similar. Ishbosheth, just because they're obviously somewhat related in the way they sound, Ishbosheth means man of shame. Ish, Bosheth is that shame or idolatry. Ish is man of shame. Mephibosheth is executioner of idolatry or executioner of the shame. Aren't you better for knowing that? Yes you are. And Mephibosheth answered, here is your servant. So David said to him, do not fear. Right? He knows what people would be thinking. Do not fear, for I will surely show you kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul your grandfather, and you shall eat bread at my table continually. Then he bowed himself, and he said, listen to what Mephibosheth said. What is your servant, that you should look upon such a dead dog as I? There's a good heart there. Who am I that you would even consider me King David? But he's already explained it's because of that great love for Jonathan. So then the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given to your master's son all that belonged to Saul and to all his house. You therefore and your sons and your servants shall work the land for him. And you shall bring in the harvest, that your master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's son, shall eat bread at my table always. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so will your servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table like one of the king's sons. 3 times he said that, and the 3rd time he really landed the plane. Mephibosheth is going to be like one of my sons now. Beautiful faith and love. Time went by. David's kingdom was established, but because of the sin with Bathsheba, bad times were coming, right? He was going to have to pay 4 times. So what happens? In chapter 15, we have the rebellion of David's son Absalom. And the rebellion is so bad that Absalom takes possession of Jerusalem and of David's concubines, and David actually has to flee Jerusalem. As he's fleeing Jerusalem, David comes across Ziba. He can't come across Mephibosheth because what's Mephibosheth's problem? He can't move that well. He can't travel. And what happens? Chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, when David was a little past the top of the mountain, there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. Oops, and the number 2 that I didn't erase from where I copied this verse from. And the king said to Ziba, "What do you mean to do with these?" So Ziba said, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who are faint in the wilderness to drink." Then the king said, "And where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem, for he said, 'Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me.'" So the king said to Ziba, "Here, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And Ziba said, "I humbly bow before you, that I may find favor in your sight, my lord, O king." The reason I said it like that is because he's lying. That's not what Mephibosheth said. He's taking advantage of this opportunity to get stuff. His master was dead. You could probably see Ziba saying, "Now I get to have all the things that were my master's, but now David shows favor on this Mephibosheth, gives it all to him, and I'm back to being a servant." Well, here comes an opportunity, and what does Ziba do? He lies about Mephibosheth to David, and he gets what he wants, all the stuff, all in the semblance of being meek and kind. "And look, I brought you food and drink as you flee the city." Well, time went by. Chapter 18. Absalom's rebellion is put down. Absalom is killed. David returns to Jerusalem. Mephibosheth goes to see David. Chapter 19, verses 24 and 25. Now Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. And he had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he returned in peace. So it was when he had come to Jerusalem to meet the king that the king said to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" Now, there's a silliness to that. He's a cripple. He can't move unless he's taken or carried. He's not taken care of. He's basically been in mourning the whole time David was gone. And then when David comes back, he says, "Why didn't you go with me?" And Mephibosheth answered, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me." That's Ziba. "For your servant said, 'I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go to the king,' because your servant is lame. And he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God. Therefore, do what is good in your eyes. For all my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king. Yet you set your servant among those who eat at your own table. Therefore, what right have I still to cry out any more to the king?" What a heart. He says, "My servant tricked me, trapped me here. I was stuck here in Jerusalem, and he went and he lied to you about me. But I'm not even going to go on about that. I was as dead anyways. You're the one that allowed me to even be here to enjoy life at all. I'm not going to bother you with my troubles." How did David respond? So the king said to him, "Why do you speak any more of your matters? I have said, you and Ziba divide the land." Then Mephibosheth said to the king, "Rather, let him take it all, inasmuch as my lord the king has come back in peace to his own house." Oh my. Not David at his best, right? David gets confronted with this truth. But what has David just been through? His beloved son has rebelled against him. Contrary to his orders, that Joab guy. Now his son is dead. He's come back, a lot of trouble, a lot of hassles. He's apparently been lied to, and how can you determine who actually said the truth and who didn't? And fine. Didn't I say to you, got divided up? No, you didn't, but now you have? Okay. Seems kind of harsh. At least he's giving Mephibosheth a little something. But again, notice the heart of Mephibosheth. What does he say? No. As long as you're okay, King, I don't need anything. As long as you're okay. Well, time goes by. David's kingdom has been restored, and suddenly there's famine in the land. Chapter 21. David, as a wise Bible scholar, understands that if there's famine in Israel, there must be a problem with God. So he goes and inquires of God, and he says, why is there famine? And God tells them, because of the bloodthirstiness of Saul against the Gibeonites. We don't know exactly what that was. All we know is this passage where it says Saul was zealous for Israel and Judah and killed a lot of the Gibeonites. Do you remember who the Gibeonites were in the book of Judges? They were the ones that tricked Joshua in the conquest of Canaan into making a covenant with them. Remember, God had told them to go in and kill every man, woman, child, and beast, to make no covenant with any people of the land. But the Gibeonites dressed themselves in old clothes, gave themselves moldy bread, and came to Joshua like they had traveled from a far country. And they said, hey, let's make a covenant. And Joshua did, and then found out they were actually Amorites from right there in the land. But God, right, a God of covenants, demanded that they keep that covenant. Joshua and the children of Israel wanted to kill them for their lies. God said, it shall not be so. You got to honor that covenant. And so they kind of enslaved them, made them water carriers and such. Well, apparently Saul, this is conjecture, was he really popular with his people toward the end? No, they were all going after David. It looks like he may have attacked the Gibeonites as a way of trying to say, see, I'm like Joshua, I'm killing the people of the land. Even though, obviously, they were part of Israel at that time, and he had no right to break that covenant. So David went to the Gibeonites, and he said, how can we make this right? This famine is because of the way Saul treated you. And the Gibeonites said, what we want is not silver, not gold. We want 7 descendants of Saul to kill. And notice what David did. Oops, sorry. He gave them 7 descendants of Saul, but he skipped the closer ones of Mephibosheth. The king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah, and the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up before Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. Whew. Again, Hebrew women stayed up all night thinking up all these names. What happened? David was commanded, he had to give descendants of Saul to the Gibeonites to be killed. He spared Mephibosheth. One last act of kindness that we have recorded. That's all we know about Mephibosheth, but it's a pretty good snapshot of him. It looks like he didn't fall far from the tree of his father. He seemed to be a faithful and good man. Well, the title of the sermon was Mephibosheth and Us. So what about us? What can we learn from this? What do we have in common with Mephibosheth? Well, Mephibosheth found himself in trouble, in dire straits, crippled, all these problems that he had because of the sins, if you will, of his ancestors. Specifically his grandfather Saul. That's where a lot of this trouble came from. Well, We too, brethren, don't we find ourselves in a world dominated by sin? Don't we find ourselves in a world where Satan is called the Lord of this world, where he's called the prince of the power of the air? Well, a lot of that is due and laid at the feet of our progenitor, Adam, because through him sin entered the world, and through sin, death. More specifically with our lives, the circumstances we find ourselves in, whether good or bad, attributed largely to our ancestors, those who have gone before. Now we must say, being in America, being Americans, we are the blessed in this world. Our ancestors were good enough for us to put us in this wonderful country so that we have all that we have. But with all that blessing and all that plenty, there's also all that temptation still, isn't there? Kind of like with the book of Judges. When things were going well, that's when spiritually things can go worse. So like him, we have troubling circumstances that we face in our life. And in many ways, we are weak and lame like he is because of the fallen world that we find ourselves in. David, the king, you remember, had called Mephibosheth to come to him and to eat at his table. We too, brethren, have been called by the king to come and eat at his table. This was done because of consideration of Mephibosheth's father. Well, our Father, because of his consideration, our spiritual Father, our heavenly Father, sent Jesus into the world that would allow us to come to the table. Think of Psalm 23. Think of preparing a table for us in the midst of our enemies. Think of how we sit at this table, and by faith we remain at this table until the feast actually comes. And brethren, you know the feast is coming, yes? It's coming. It's promised at the end of Revelation. It's going to be a wonderful feast that we get to be a part of if we remain faithful. Like Mephibosheth, called to the king's table to enjoy that feast. And like Ziba, we too have a slanderer that we have to always be on guard about. Because the devil is always looking to lie about us, to try and get God to think that we don't love him, to try and to trick us like he did with Israel over and over. Remember that great scene in Zechariah chapter 3 where we have that court scene and Israel represented by Joshua the high priest, and there's the devil making accusation against him, and there's the angel of the Lord, probably our Lord, acting as the defense attorney, stepping forward and declaring us innocent. The devil's always making those accusations. From the beginning, in the garden, remember? He told Adam and Eve, God doesn't love you, because if God loved you, he wouldn't deny you the fruit from this tree. The only reason he's denying you this is because he doesn't want you to be as great as he is. God doesn't love you. And then by partaking of it, he could then go to God and say, see, they don't love you. They disobeyed you. On and on he does that, trying to constantly get us. With Job, right? He says to God, Satan says, the only reason Job respects you and honors you is because you've protected him, because you've blessed him, because you put a hedge around him. You let me touch him and harm him, he'll curse you to his face. See, the devil cannot understand love. The love of God for us and our returned love to him. So he's always trying to lie and say that God doesn't love us. Because if he can get us to believe that God doesn't love us, then we'll stop loving him. Every time. We have to watch that slanderer. We need to live our lives in such a way that God knows our love. And we understand that that's by faithful obedience. Therefore, consider the story, brethren. A king's benevolence toward a weak and lame servant. Isn't it an apt illustration of our walk with our God? We are slaves of sin, unable to solve our sin problem in and of ourselves, but God, there's those two words again, but God, he sent his Son to die pay the price, that we might be free, that we might be able to be reconciled with him, that we might be able to walk with him. We who were lame in sin, now free. And I found this interesting. Do you remember what Mephibosheth said? And it's not easy to say said after Mephibosheth. Do you remember what Mephibosheth bespoke? No. Anyways. It says that he bowed himself and he said, "What is your servant that you should look upon such a dead dog as I?" That's humility. But do you remember what David said, speaking about God in Psalm 8, verse 4? David wrote, "What is man, that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man, that you visit him?" Mephibosheth said, "King, why have you called me, basically a dead dog, useless, to your table? Why would you do this?" And David said the same thing about God with regards to us. You who created the universe and the stars were just the little work, the easy stuff. Why would you call us to your table? Why would you give us dominion over your creation? Why would you be mindful of us and constantly caring for us? A beautiful lesson for us to consider, this Mephibosheth. Brethren, where are you in your walk right now? If you're not a Christian, are you weak and lame in sin? Unable to walk with God because sin and God cannot be together? Do you want to walk with God? The King has invited you to his table. The King has sent his Son to call you to the table. He sent his Son to shed his blood that you might come and be washed and cleansed to come to the table. And that feast is coming, and he's prepared it. Why won't you come? Why not accept his invitation? Accept his grace and come forward this evening. Be baptized for the remission of your sin, the likeness of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and arise from the waters to newness of life, once lame but now able to walk with the Lord unto everlasting. If you've never done that, why not tonight? Christians, it's difficult. The ups and downs of our physical existence, the good times and the bad times, we need to never lose sight of all that we have in Christ. That the King has invited us. That we, who have anointed ourselves with the blood of his Son, are able to sit at that table, and if we will simply remain steadfast, dwell with him, the feast is ours and the crown of life. If there's anything we can do to help you, if you need any help from the church, we'd ask that you come forward as together we stand and sing.